and a warm welcome to you. Thanks for joining this episode of Conversations with UX Copenhagen. Today, I'm your host, Helle Martens. I run the annual UX Copenhagen conference, in case you didn't know. And my co-host is Lone Ørum. That's her waving. Unfortunately, we're not sitting together today because of Corona, but next time we will be sitting at the fantastic board of Post-its behind Lone. We were just talking about them before we started recording, and it's actually, we drew out, Lone and I had a session where we drew out every single participant for next year's conference, or this year's conference. So here she goes, showing them. Yeah, we had so much fun. At one point we were like totally dry for ideas, and we're like, I have no idea what to draw now. And then we decided to challenge, to put up a challenge and say, all right, we have to draw anybody who walks by the window. You want to show my favorite one, Nona?
Oh. Let me see if I can catch you.
That one. There was a very short one. I had so much fun with that. Yeah. So anyway, here we are with the fantastic Dave Dylan Thomas. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So if anybody, just in case you haven't seen it, I will send out a link after we've had this talk, but Dave did a fantastic talk at UX Copenhagen 2018, and it's on our YouTube channel. So go ahead and go watch that one. And it's all about cognitive bias. And if I may say so, it was basically your first talk about your book, right?
Yeah, it's funny. That was actually a foundational piece of the puzzle that eventually got me to the book. So prior to that, do you mind if I just go into a little inside baseball here? So prior to that, I had been learning about cognitive bias. Like I say in the talk, I'd seen Irrespondent's talk, and I was obsessed with cognitive bias. I think at that point I had started doing the podcast, and then I had been, because of the podcast, I'd been invited by the city of Philadelphia to come and speak about accessibility. They're doing a panel on accessibility, and they wanted to include cognitive bias as a form of accessibility. And that was the first time it's almost like a comic doing routine, and like first they get together, they're tight five. Like that was the first time I did any kind of like, here's what I know about design, here's what I know about bias, let's put them together. So I did about 10 minutes on that. But then through a series of podcasts, including Saskia's, like I got on your radar and you invited me to come speak. Again, forever grateful, come speak in Copenhagen, which was, by the way, my first international conference. And it was like, oh, okay, I've got to take these 10 minutes and turn it into a real talk. And in doing that, and I don't know if I ever told you this, so the weekend before I was supposed to fly out, I was still working on the talk and I didn't have an ending yet. And as I was writing the end, I actually kind of found the talk, because the end is when I start talking about our biases as designers, which really means I'm talking about design ethics. I'm like, oh, this is actually a talk about design ethics. That's what this is. So that like aha moment that made that talk, and then that was also the first time I think I called it Design for Cognitive Bias. That then became the same structure for the book, that would keep the title Design for Cognitive Bias and have that structure of, let's look at user biases. Let's look at our boss's biases. Okay, let's look at our biases. And now you realize this whole book was really about design ethics all along. Gotcha.
Which is excellent, because that was the whole theme for the conference. So I'm really happy that worked out.
And I will also give you like this. I really appreciated that. It was one of the first conferences I went to where like you go to a lot of conferences and they say, hey, our theme this year is whatever. And like maybe the opening keynote and the closing keynote are kind of on that theme, and then everything else is just whatever they could get. UX Copenhagen was one of the first times I was like, oh no, they mean it. Really, every single talk here is about design ethics.
And it's become quite an overarching theme for the whole conference ever since, I think.
Yeah, it's and the speakers you've gotten in that time are some of like my favorite, like Sarah Walker-Becher and Eva Penzi-Moog, like awesome people.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. I mean, everybody who speaks at UX Copenhagen is an awesome person. No, really, it is. It's a great collection of great people. The whole community around UX Copenhagen is great. I mean, I think UX is a great community. I think that we're very empathetic and kind people.
Yeah, and I think that, it helps, I think that at least in principle, that's the point, right? user experience. You are meant to think about someone other than yourself. You're meant to think about what it would be like for someone to experience something other than yourself. We do not always achieve this goal, but at least it's baked into the job assignment that you are going to, like, it benefits you to do these things and be empathetic, as opposed to other jobs that might not benefit from, that might not reward that kind of empathy.
Yeah. It's so funny. I'm reading the book called Humankind by Rutger Bregman. Do you know it?
That sounds familiar.
You have to read it. Rutger Bregman, I think it was in 2016 where he went to Davos and he like called out all the billionaires and he said, basically, you know, the reason that the world is going to shit is because you guys aren't paying taxes. Well, yeah. Sure. And no, and then he wrote this book, his recent book is Humankind, and it is so good. It is such a good book. But he basically says that empathy is actually bad because it puts a spotlight on one thing and then you ignore everything else.
Yeah, I think hyper focused on any particular aspect. Like I am very familiar with the empathy is bad argument.
Really?
Mike Turnoff, I've talked about this a lot. I think it is not. So I don't go whole hog on like empathy is evil, because a lack of empathy is actually a sign of psychopathy, right? Like we know you're a psychopath because you hurt that animal and felt nothing.
Right.
We don't want that. However, we also don't want to replace participatory design, moving power around. We don't want to use empathy as a way to not do that, right? So I've been getting very big into participatory design lately. I touched on it a little bit in the book. I sort of have an open call out to anyone who really knows this stuff to write a book about it. I will happily put you in touch with people who are good at publishing books to do that. But no, participatory design, I think, fills that gap, because I think empathy is good in that if I see someone get hit by a car and I don't feel anything, that's bad. You feeling that is a knee-jerk DNA built into evolution reaction. It is called empathy. It is good. It is not, however, enough to found a inclusive design practice. Right. It is like part 1 of 5, right? I think where we need to focus, or at least what I like to do, is to say, okay, here's what empathy can do, but then here's what giving power to people who don't usually have power can do, right? And how that can inform the process and get you to this ultimate goal, which is I'm going to build this thing and it's going to be good, not just for the business, not just for the user, but for society as well. Like we're going to hit that trifecta. Yeah. So that's kind of where I usually explore the whole empathy topic.
Right. Okay. Well, that's basically what the whole conference is about this year. I've called the theme creating a culture change, but that's basically summed it up with that.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So again, you fit in perfectly. I knew it. But no, please tell me, you will be hosting a workshop this year? Yes.
So I have, it's funny. I'll talk a little bit about the journey from that first UX Copenhagen I was at a few years ago. So in that time, I ended up writing this book called Design for Cognitive Bias, all about the different biases that we have, that our users have, and how there are actually design and content choices we can make that either mitigate those biases or sometimes actually use them for good. And that book has now developed into a workshop. And the workshop basically says, okay, all these ideas I'm talking about in the book, let's actually get some practice, right? So if we do a section where we're talking about how the way that you phrase something or design a statement can make it more or less believable. Okay, I'm going to give you an exercise now. We're going to take a statement and you're going to use all the tools we just learned about to make it more believable, right? Or if we do a section where we talk about goal setting and how critical it is to set goals and metrics that actually align. And what we often do is create metrics that actually fight our goals. So for example, if you're in policing and you say, hey, cops, you're going to get a bonus for the number of arrests you make. Well, if the goal of having police is to reduce crime and crime goes away, that actually disincentivizes me because now I can't make any more arrests. So you've actually incentivized the opposite of what you want, right? So we say, hey, this happens in design all the time where we set some metric that's actually working against our goal. So let's do an exercise where I'm going to give you a really tricky situation and you need to come up with a metric that doesn't actually make things worse, right? So we go through all these different sort of, if my talk tells all these stories about bias in design, the workshop lets you actually try to fix them, right? And get and work in groups to try to say, okay, and the goal is to say, okay, now that you've learned all these techniques, you can pick which of these techniques you want to bring back to your practice, whether you're a solo practitioner or whether you work in an organization. And we do talk about how to convince the higher ups maybe to buy into some of these things. You actually know what it's like now to do a red team, blue team, or to do an assumption audit. You actually know what it feels like to do these things. So you can judge for yourself, hey, I'm ready to say, hey, boss, next time for this next project, before we kick off, can we do an assumption audit and have this structured conversation about our biases or whatever it is? Because you'll have actually done it.
Yeah. And that's actually easier to buy into than saying, hey, can we do, a Pareto type, or can we do a usability test before we begin, or
yeah, exactly. And I try to my goal is to give you the knowledge about, what these different techniques are that can help you avoid bias in your work, give you experience, what it feels like to do these things, but then also give you tools to actually convince other people to do these things. So one of the things we talk about is, so there's this exercise called an assumption audit, where before you begin a project, you basically take everyone in the room who's going to work on it and you ask questions like, well, who are we, right? And you're only identifying as you feel comfortable, but you sort of think about things like gender or age or neurodiversity. And then you say, okay, well, who are, and how might those identities influence this thing we're working on, right? You try to be honest about that. And then you say, well, who isn't here, right? And you try to be honest about who's not in the room. And you talk about, well, how is their absence gonna maybe influence the outcome of this thing? And then you have an honest discussion about, well, what could we do then to include, honor, and maybe give some power to the folks who aren't here right now as we go through this design process. And that's a meeting, depending on the size of the group or the project, it's maybe a 2-hour meeting. And you can go to your boss then and say, hey, on this next project, rather than saying, hey, I want to overhaul the way we do design at company X, and it's going to take months and we're going to have a committee. You say, hey, on this next project, it's like a 600-hour project. Can I get 2 hours to do this little meeting? I've done it before. It's great. Trust me, right? That's a lot easier to get your boss to buy into than saying, all right, it's time to overhaul the entire design process and how we charge for things and blah, blah, blah. So I try to give you some of that, some of those strategies so that the very next day, if you want, you can go to your boss and say, hey, heard about this thing. It takes 2 hours. Do you want to try it?
Yeah. And what did you call it? The assumption audit?
Assumption audit. Yeah.
On it.
Audit. Assumption AUDIT.
Audit. Okay. Thank you. That is smart. I was like, audit.
Yeah, I borrowed that from with permission. We steal from each other all the time. Project Inkblot, which does amazing work in this area. I met their founders and I was like, so I kind of want to borrow this, and they're like, oh yeah, take it.
Okay. Inkblot. That's cool. Awesome. Well, it kind of sounds like we need you to do a talk as well. I mean,
you know me, I love to talk.
Yeah. But would the workshop work without a talk?
What's that?
Would the workshop work without a talk?
Oh, it does. It does. I mean, anyone who's had seen my talk and done the workshop is like, okay, I see what you did there. There's a lot of the talk. Basically, the workshop is the talk, but every now and then we stop and say, okay, that thing I just talked about, now we're going to do it.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, that sounds awesome. I hope everybody here signs up, because it sounds like we're going to learn a lot of things. And it also sounds like it's going to sum up the entire conference, because we'll actually get some tools to do what we've been hearing about. Yeah. So, okay. So you do a podcast as well?
Yeah. So I did a podcast, formally speaking. So around the time I once saw Irrespondent, this amazing speaker who did a talk, and I think a book as well, called Gender Equality by Design. Saw her give this talk, and she's getting into different ways that just pattern recognition kind of results in the kinds of biases you see in hiring, right? So for example, if I say the word web developer and the image that pops into your head is skinny white guy, it's not because you think that dudes are better at programming than women, far from it, but the pattern you might have seen in movies and television, and maybe offices you've worked in, right, starts to make that equation. And so subconsciously, if you see a name at the top of a resume that doesn't fit skinny white dude, all of a sudden you're giving that resume the side eye, right? So that as an idea, that pattern recognition, right? Just treating people differently because they don't fit the pattern. Pattern recognition is just something that's fundamentally human, right? It's just the thing that's, and I became obsessed with this idea that, well, if that's what's going on, I feel like I can do something more about that than I can about someone who's truly explicitly racist, right? I'm not going to fix somebody who's like a member of the KKK, but someone who like actually genuinely believes that people are equal, but isn't behaving that way because of pattern recognition. Okay, I need to learn more about this. So I went to the Rational Wiki page for cognitive biases, and I looked at one bias a day, and I became the guy who wouldn't shut up about cognitive bias. And I ended up doing a podcast because my one friend in particular was like, you've got to do a podcast. And this is a friend of mine who used to work for TED. And like, when your friend who works for TED is saying you should do a podcast, you should do a podcast. So I did the podcast, and I did that for about 3 years. And during that time, like I said, I started to build out this talk about design for cognitive bias and wrote the book. And then I did this final season in 2020 when the book came out to kind of promote that. And it was sort of like conversations with different kind of tech leaders about cognitive bias. And then I kind of shuddered at that. And I literally, a few weeks ago, started a brand new podcast called Lately I've Been Thinking About, which is basically, I have a guest on, and at the beginning of the podcast, I ask them, so what have you been thinking about lately? And whatever they're thinking about, that's what we're talking about, right? It could be knitting. It could be, I could have, Barack Obama on, and if what he's been thinking about lately is knitting, that's what we're talking about, right? And it's just this sort of open forum, because what I found with the Cognitive Bias podcast is I would have these really cool guests I'd want to have on, but if they weren't into cognitive bias, I'd have to have some kind of excuse. It's like, whereas like with this, I'm sort of like, I just want to talk to you because you're cool. Like, I don't really care about whether it's about cognitive bias or not. And, knowing me, I'll find a way to make it about cognitive bias anyway. So that's sort of like podcasts, where I'm on podcasts right now, but there's a whole, I don't know, over 100 episodes of the Cognitive Bias podcast just sitting there in iTunes or whatever your podcast platform of choice is.
Yeah. Somebody here. Awesome. No, that's so good. And it's called Lately I've Been Thinking About. Or...
Mm-hmm. So the first episode just dropped, and I'm lining up my guests for the first season. So hopefully by the spring, if not earlier, all the rest of the episodes for this season will drop.
Oh, that is so cool. Yeah, no, that's my favorite part about these talks also. And that's also why I started doing these recordings of them, because I mean, usually the talks will go all over the place. Like you and I've been, right before we started recording, we were talking about all sorts of things. And that's what makes these talks really interesting, is just, talking to cool people. Yeah. Definitely. And letting the talk go wherever. I mean, of course, it's always going to be about, UX Copenhagen and about the conference and whatever talks are going to be made there. But it's also super interesting to get to know people. And I think it's really fun to share that with others. Like, so it doesn't just have to be me. And, when we're doing these conversations, it can be like, oh, now I understand why she absolutely had to have him back, or, kind of.
Yeah. And it's called, just noticing in the chat, it's called the Cognitive Bias Podcast. I'm just putting the title in.
Yeah.
You can see, so literally part of the reason I was able to even do the podcast was I kept it small. So I know me well enough to know that if I try to bite off more than I can chew, I just won't get started. So I deliberately picked something where I could record an episode in an hour. Okay. So the very first, because I'd studied these biases already. So all I had to do is like do a little refresher course, write up some show notes, and then hit record. So the very first episode, you can hear me do this in the very first episode, because I didn't even know what I was going to call it. I just started recording. I'm like, and so this is the Cognitive Bias Podcast. Like, that's the title. Does what it says on the tin,
That's what it's about. So perfect. That's fun. And so you did that why did you stop? Are there no
I basically ran out of biases.
Really? Oh no.
Yeah. I went through, and it's funny too. You can go through. I am so transparent about this. So I said I went to the Rational Wiki page, and there's a list of cognitive biases. If you look at the episode listing and even the seasons, right? Because the Rational Wiki page is split into types of biases. So each season maps perfectly onto each of those groupings, and each episode more or less goes in order. It's sort of like, okay, what's next? All right, fundamental attribution error. Okay, what's next? I mean, it is like it is like the episode guide, right? It's just right there. And then eventually I got to the end of that page. I'm like, I don't really have anything else to talk about. And I've got these other projects I kind of want to work on. So I don't know. I'm a big believer in things having endings. Like I grew up on like sitcom TV and all this stuff that just like at the end of the episode, you loop back to where you were at the beginning so that you can just keep going forever. And that kind of had a place, but there's a lot of value in stuff that's just sort of like has a beginning, middle, and end. And you'd sort of look at like, at first it was like British television or maybe HBO, where they would just be like, okay, two seasons of The Office, we're done.
Yeah.
But then, and it's funny, now we're actually in an age where it's more typical to say, okay, this is a limited series, right? Or this is gonna have like maybe 3 seasons, right? And if it goes any longer, it's probably not gonna be very good. So we've kind of come like, all the way around to this other side of thinking about it. But yeah, with the Cognitive Bias podcast, like part of me was like, if I was really deeply into podcasting, like as my chosen like form of doing like in making, I might have tried to milk it and let's get subscribe or sponsors and make it a whole thing. But again, going back to that whole, I don't want to bite off more than I can chew. It's just sort of like, no, you know what? I've pretty much said everything I have to say on this. And now this has sort of set the table for this next meal. So I'm gonna have this next meal now, and we're gonna, just move on to the next thing. So I was comfortable at that point saying, okay, this has been awesome. People have really enjoyed it, but like sunset, sunrise.
Having an ending. That's really interesting because I really hate endings. I'm like, I like hold on to things for way too long. And I don't know, as a kid, I don't know if you know this, but I moved around a lot. I was born in the States, and then we moved to like Switzerland, Scotland, back to the States. I've lived all over the place. And hold on, just mute this person. But anyway, yeah, so, I hated having to move and start over again. And then, yeah, I don't know. I guess that's probably why I don't like endings.
No, I get that. It's funny too, because I have a different kind of relationship to place. So, without going too far into it, like I grew up in a broken home sounds so dramatic, but basically my dad wasn't there. And I didn't really meet him until much later in life. And so the whole notion of a nuclear family, and that's sort of like, here's where we live and here's where we grow up and all that stuff, I never really bought into. And so I never really felt much connection to place in that sense. And so, but I don't know how that ties exactly to, or if there's a connection between that and sort of my lack of connection to things having to last forever. I think honestly, as a storyteller, I think that's part of it. As a storyteller, I find that I've grown a preference for things that have like a natural life cycle versus sort of a thing that just goes on forever. And it's sort of like choosing what you want to go on forever. So like, this even kind of comes back to the UX discussion, like values, I think, are things that you want sort of written in stone and they go on forever, like creativity, compassion, like whatever we're doing, it may not be what we were doing yesterday, but it's going to have creativity. It's going to have curiosity. It's going to have compassion. Whereas sort of like the expressions of that may have a beginning, middle, and end. So like right now, we were talking before, I used to run this conference called Bar Camp. And for about 3 years, that was my expression of community. The fact that I value community and curiosity. I expressed that through helping make this conference happen, where people would just show up, write down what they wanted to talk about, and that was the conference, right? That was a great expression of that. But there came a time when it's sort of like, okay, it's time to move on to another expression. So for me, the permanence came from whatever I'm doing, it's going to be about creativity and community, but the actual thing I'm doing might have a natural beginning, middle, and end.
It's probably a very healthy way to look at it. I mean,
and like that comes from a decent amount of therapy. I don't want to pretend I came up with that on my own.
Maybe that's what I'm lacking.
Oh, highly recommend it if you have access to it. Wonderful sort of like second brain to keep you from getting like caught up in your own kind of limitations.
Yeah, because it's so strange. Everything is just in our own minds, right?
And it's funny, there's a question there about what techniques do you employ so that cognitive bias does not become your bias. I mean, that second brain part, you'll see like in my book, I talk a lot about the value of outside perspectives, because the trick with bias, and let me just back up here a little bit. Like when I say bias, and specifically cognitive bias, I'm talking about the fact that your mind just takes shortcuts to get through the day, because you have to make like 1 trillion decisions a day. Like I am deciding right now how fast to talk, whether it's my turn to speak, what to do with my hands, right? And if I think very carefully about every single one of those decisions, I will never get anything done. So most of our lives are on autopilot, and that's good. That's actually a really good thing, because you would not function otherwise. When the autopilot gets it wrong, we call that a cognitive bias, right? When I think that if I roll the die harder, I'm going to get a higher number, that's not true, but it's this autopilot thing that your mind is doing, right? So one of the ways that you can kind of like account for that, because you can't get rid of it. If you got rid of it, you would just be sitting there very slowly deciding everything. So you're not going to get rid of it, but what you can do is account for it by saying, well, here's someone else with a different lived experience. They've got a different bias. They're going to jump to a different conclusion. So let me bring their perspective in, right? And if you bring in the right perspectives, right, or enough perspectives, you start to say, oh, okay, I get it. This is the whole puzzle. I was only looking at one piece of it, or I was looking at it from my own. But if we put all these perspectives together, preferably be perspectives from people who don't have a lot of power, you start to get this fuller picture, right? And that's one way to kind of account for, one technique to kind of account for bias. And I would say therapy is fantastic for that, because these are people who are trained to spot, oh, that conclusion you're jumping to, yeah, like we did a study, literally 100,000 other people also jumped to that conclusion, and we think this is why.
That sounds awesome. It sounds like you have a great therapist. I wish, yeah, I wouldn't know how to find one in Denmark that was as talented. Maybe, yeah, I don't know. Maybe look for somebody who has done research in cognitive bias, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how it is in Denmark. I'm in the States. You find the person who fits your plan.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Here you just say,
because we don't like health in America.
I know. Not sure if we should go down that rabbit hole. Tell me about your TED Talk.
Oh, so back in the day, I had been doing this talk about basically how design influences discourse, right? So if people are having a conversation and they're yelling at each other, it might not just be that they're both angry. It also might be, well, what color is the room? Where are they sitting? How are they situated with each other? What were they doing right before? What, design actually influences conversation. 45-minute talk. My friend who works at TED was like, hey, did you know TED is doing this thing called TED NYC? That's basically like American Idol for TED, where it's like everybody in the world can send video and they'll pick like 10 folks to actually speak at an official TED event. And so I submitted my thing, like my 1 minute, my Type 5. And I got picked and I went, and it was like, great, that 45-minute talk, I need you to whittle it down to 6 minutes.
Oh my God.
So here's the thing about TED. TED, it is no coincidence that TED has the prominence it does, because you go in there and you give like your best version of your talk. They have a whole rehearsal the day before, and you go in there and you give your talk in front of like this sort of counselor person who's like listening to all the talks, and like you give your talk, you come off the stage and they're like, okay, this works, ditch that, you don't actually need that, think about this, boom. And you're like, I'm giving my talk tomorrow. So I went back to my hotel room and I did what she asked, and I'm like, oh my God, this is so much better.
Oh.
Like, they are that good. They deeply understand storytelling. And that's the thing to remember about TED. Like when you go into TED, so when you go into the, at least for the New York office where they were doing this event, it's a TV studio. Like they are putting on a show. First and foremost, TED is an entertainment venue. And that's part of the reason I think they're so successful, is because they get that they're putting on a show. And first and foremost, if you go to a TED Talk, you're going to be entertained. You might be inspired, you might be educated, but if nothing else, you will be entertained. So it is set up just like a TV studio with all the thing, and like they got it down, right? And they understand, hey, this is what's going to capture the audience. This is what's going to like turn them off. Here's how to take what you, and they're not doing it in a way where it's like, dilute what you have to say. It's like, I understand what you want to say, but let me tell you how to say it. Okay. So that schooled me. Like I thought I was good at giving talks, but like I got schooled. And it's funny too. I took it from 45 minutes to 6 minutes, and I added new stuff. Like there's a whole bit at the end of that TED Talk where I talk about the 3 rules of productive discourse, which did not exist in the 45-minute version. Because I needed to figure out what is actually going on here in these 45 minutes and whittle it down to 6, I had to have that kind of like summation at the end. And that made the talk so much better. And now it's a part of the 45-minute version, but it didn't, but like once I had them, like, oh, this is the thing. It's kind of like with UX Copenhagen, it's like, this is what the talk's about. Okay. And so I actually recommend anybody who's working on a talk, especially if it's a long talk, even if you're never going to give the 5-minute version, create the 5-minute version.
Okay.
Because that forces you to understand, no, really, what am I actually talking about here? And it's so easy. I do it all the time. It's so easy to write a talk and you have no idea what you're actually talking about. Whittling it down to 5 minutes, it's like, okay, at the end of the day, it's about this. And as a professional, because that's like my job now, I go out and give talks. As a professional, I need to be able to give the 20-minute version of a talk, the 35-minute version of a talk, the 30-minute version of a talk, the 45-minute version, the 5-minute version. I need to be able to like mix and match depending on how much time the client has for the talk or whatever. And knowing what the talk is really about gives me a guide to say, okay, I don't really need to get into that. It's a cool story, but I don't really need to get into that. This, however, is critical. Okay, let me put that in, right? So it's a, so I guess what I'm saying is I recommend you give a TED Talk because you will learn so much. Like that's a thing you can just sort of like sign up for. But yeah, like, but creating that version, I think is highly, highly powerful thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Has anybody else in the audience tried giving a TED Talk? Or would anybody else have the guts to do it?
Yeah.
There's silence. Does anybody have any questions? One day. Yeah. Marley, what would you talk about? I'm just pouncing on you because
that's the thing is like I don't know what I would talk about yet. I think I need to gain some more life experiences first.
Yeah.
There is a I've also done TEDx's, and there is a course they have you go through when you do a TEDx. It's sort of like how to decide on your topic. Like they really do walk you. It is like a class in giving talks. And one of the things I actually do at the beginning is just say how to figure out what you want to talk about. And it ends up being like a mix of what are you passionate about? What do you have personal experience with? What I call is what's the thing you just can't shut up about? Right? What's the thing where your friends are like, oh God, this again? Like that's a good sign that this is the thing you should give a talk about.
That's a good tip.
I don't have any tips on public speaking courses. There's someone in the chat asking about public speaking, but what I do, like I do a very informal like talk on giving talks. One thing I will say, and this is just my own personal philosophy on talking, don't pick anything too formal. I find that there is I won't say this is the only school of thought on giving talks, but there is a school of thought on giving talks, which is very European. It's very, this is how you speak. This is how you enunciate. This is the main thesis. This is this, like, it's very much about, it's very much a paint by numbers, very white, to be honest. Like even your voice, like it is a very like received English approach to giving talks. And I won't say it's dishonest. I think there are techniques they're talking about that are fairly well-worn techniques, but I think it is not taking advantage of the uniqueness that every speaker gives. I mean, I've had speakers of color come to me and be like, I feel like I shouldn't use my normal voice when I give talks. And my advice to them is like that. That is a terrible idea. The market on speaking in a European voice has been cornered. We have plenty of that. Yeah, we don't have you. We don't have your voice. Yeah. So however you speak, however you get your ideas across, that's unique. And kind of like I was saying before with like values versus like expressions of those values, the value of being engaging, of finding a hook, something for your audience to like, all of those things translate, but they translate in different ways. Like my approach to public speaking is much more like stand-up comedy, where there are a lot of stand-up comics out there, but they have very different, like John Mulaney's approach is very different from Richard Pryor's, is very different from Amy Schumer's, is very different from Wanda Sykes. Like they're all kind of doing the same thing. They're standing on a stage and speaking, right? Yeah, but their approaches are very unique to their voice. Like they don't all sound the same. They don't use structure the same way. They don't move the same way, right? And all of the things that they're doing, you can kind of reverse engineer and be like, oh, they did that to achieve this, right? And the this that they're achieving, that's universal. but how they got there. So if you're shopping around for public speaking courses, try to avoid ones that are like, this is the 5-step, whatever, do these things. Try to find ones that are really trying to bring out you, explain to you what's valuable, right? And what you want to achieve while you're on stage, but don't necessarily be prescriptive about you. The only way to achieve that is talk like this, move like that, never say whatever it is. Like, no, that's suspicious.
Those are great tips. Do you know of Toastmasters?
Yeah, and I was kind of sort of dunking on them a little bit.
All right.
I haven't taken the
That's what
Toastmasters
you
course, so I'm
need.
not gonna like by default. I know people who have taken them, and like I said, like my understanding from folks I've talked to who have taken those courses, like there is actually a lot of value in sort of the things they're teaching you. But I personally like don't want it to be about you must do that. You must hit these marks. Like it's a gymnastics routine. It's like, I don't know if that's exactly what I value in public speaking.
I think that what you were saying before about having, you know, a beginning, a middle, and an end, just like writing a book, I mean, that's essential for any story. And it sounds to me like the ending is like the most important, and summing up and is like the most important part about it, right?
Yeah, and I feel like, I don't know, like when I think about public speaking as a practice, because I do, like that's sort of like an art that I'm trying to continually get better at.
Mhm.
I think it's more that you are going to have a beginning, middle, and end, whether you want to or not, because time.
Yes.
And how are you using those spaces? How are you exploring those spaces? Because my different talks have actually very different ways they go about. Like my Design for Cognitive Bias talk has a very like big CTA kind of like rally the troops kind of ending. My civil discourse one ends with those 3 questions, what's actually more of a prompt. And then I have this whole other talk I give now that's more about like community, like it ends on this kind of warm feeling of community. But I don't, when I'm creating a talk, I don't begin with like a bunch of empty slots where it's like, okay, what's going to go in the beginning? Okay, it's got to be like this. All right, what's going to go in? It's like, no, and again, this is my process. It's much more organic. It's like, here's a bunch of stuff I'm interested in. Does it tie together at all? I don't know. Let's just start writing, you know? and like, as I go through, some things and transitions start, again, it feels very much like, I haven't done stand-up, but I watch stand-ups and it feels like a very similar kind of like the really good ones. Like watch Mike Birbiglia has a routine. It's a Netflix special. It's called Thank God for Jokes. It is on its own, just here's a funny stand-up routine. It's a funny bit. It's about an hour. But from a structure perspective, it is just, I'm trying to find a better word for masterclass because I don't want to use the word master so much, but it is a just high level, deep study of structure. And as you want, and again, he doesn't have like visuals to add structure. He just has language, and he uses language to build an actually super intricate structure, which if you watch it the second or third time, you're like, oh wait, but that's a callback to, and then that's, oh wait, and oh my God, that's like a whole labyrinth he just created, right? But that's the part that interests me, is sort of like finding your way. The way I arrive at a structure like that is to sort of like, what are the key ideas I'm playing with? And oh, right, and there's this thing here, and I pull it back over here, and oh, that's right, I can talk about that again. And if I move like that, and again, that comes from being raised in a kind of cinema background. Like I'm a filmmaker. I was making movies before I did any tech or any public speaking. So thinking about cinema, which can be an extremely structured form of storytelling, I think about that a lot, right? And sort of finding all those flows is fascinating to me. I don't even remember what the initial question was.
About talks. That's really interesting though. I mean, that's like way beyond me. I mean, I would never be able to wrap my mind around a talk that way. You know, the whole structure of it, I'm just like, yeah, I'll dive into the deep end and go do it. You know, like, oh, okay, I'll do a conference. Here we go. And just kind of, you know, throw myself into it. And then afterwards I'll be like, oh, maybe I should, you know, put some structure into this.
Well, it's funny too. I think part of it comes from like, I grew up, this is like my 20s, watching like Clay Shirky and Malcolm Gladwell, right? Folks are really able to sort of just hit you with this you know, I'm going to explain how a tree is like the Balkans in 1917. Okay, sure, go ahead, right? And it's like, I'm going to take you on a journey. And that, it's funny. One thing you'll almost never see me do at the beginning of a talk is tell you what the talk is going to be about. Which is like, again, cardinal sin. You, at the beginning of your talk, you say an outline, I'm going to talk about this, then I'm going to talk about this, then I'm going to talk about this. And because I'm coming more from that like stand-up comedy thing where it's like the stand-up comic never says, okay, we're going to do a comedy show. The first part's going to be about traffic. And the second part's, it's like, you don't do that. You just, I'm going to take you on a journey. Or when you're watching a movie, the movie never starts out with, okay, act one, we're going to do this. And then act two, the hero's going to, it's like, no, just take me on a journey. So I prefer the take you on a journey approach. Yeah. So yeah, like I end up that, but in a weird way that forces me to have more structure because I'm not giving you the structure at the beginning. Like I have to kind of like give you these little guideposts. I have to like show you the structure while we're doing it rather than be like, here's the structure up front. Now you can rest assured there's going to be structure.
Yeah. And Isabella also mentions that she gets terribly nervous. I mean, we all do. Do you still get nervous, Dave?
Not really. I mean, part of that is I have been doing this in one form or another, like since I was a kid. So I was in rock bands in high school. And that prepared me for like anything else. I mean, I was always kind of an attention hog, to be perfectly honest, but like I was lead singer in a rock band from high school all the way up through being like a solo artist, like in my 20s. And in a weird way, like I always wanted to be like a rock star when I was a kid. In a weird way, like giving talks is like scratching that itch of getting up on stage and just yelling. So that I think, but I do want to give you a tip. Anyone who gets nervous when they're speaking, there is a bias called the illusion of transparency. And the way it works is you think when you're on stage that everyone can see how nervous you are. They can't. They really can't. So there's an experiment where you have 5 people go on stage and you tell 2 of them to lie. And then afterwards you ask them, hey, do you think people knew you were lying? And they're like, oh yeah, it was obvious. I was sweating. You ask the people in the audience, hey, who was lying? And the audience is no better at chance than figuring out who. They have no idea. They have no clue. Now, the nice thing about the illusion of transparency is it is the one bias out of the hundreds of biases I've looked at. It is the one bias where if you know about it, it actually makes a difference. Most biases, I tell you about it, you're still going to do it. Illusion of transparency, though, they did an experiment where they said, okay, we're going to send people on stage. And some of them, we're going to tell them, hey, there's this thing called the illusion of transparency. Here's how it works. The people who knew about it did better on stage. So you have now been inoculated against illusion of transparency. So that's one technique. Another technique I give sometimes to designers who have to present their work is to say, okay, instead of going in there thinking that this is you walking into a room to be judged, pretend that it is still part of the design research process. That what you're actually doing is you are going in and you're showing something to the research subject to see the research subject's reaction, right? So the stakeholders are going to react to this image you're showing them. And based on that reaction, you're going to have an understanding of where the design needs to go next. So now the focus isn't on you, it's on them. They're the ones who have to perform. They're the ones who have to who are going to be observed by you. And it puts a little more control back in your hands. And I've given this advice to folks and they've come back and sort of said, yeah, that made it kind of easier to be in the room and present the work because it wasn't like being judged. It was like, no, I have to do some more research. Let me do this research. Right.
Oh, it's funny. I mean, I used to be so nervous and now I'm doing my own conferences. So Isabella, everybody can do it. And it's gotten a lot easier over the years, but I do still get nervous. I mean, in the beginning, I would be like very focused on my breath. It would like stop here and I'd be like, and I couldn't, talk or breathe or anything. Now I can be normal. One of the tricks that I actually do is I walk around and, well, back in the day when we used to be able to have live events, I would walk around and actually introduce myself to people. So I would like, shake their hand. And then, when I was standing up on stage, I would be like, oh, but I know everybody. So I felt much more at ease.
That's really funny because that, like walking around a room of strangers and introducing myself makes me way more nervous than getting on stage in front of like 100 strangers.
Oh, that's so funny.
Like, that's just like how I'm built. Like put me on stage in front of 100 people I've never met. I'm like perfectly comfortable. Let's talk about bias, blah, 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 blah. Put me in a room with those same 100 people and I have to one by one, like just walk into a conversation with them. I'm like, I'm going to go home.
So funny. That's funny. Okay, everybody does anybody have a question? Does anybody want to turn on the video or turn off the video and just unmute and say something to Dave? Any questions?
I had a question that I put in the chat. I want to know what you're reading right now.
So yeah, there's a few things. What comes to mind is I recently finished Eva Penzi Moog's Design for Safety, which is fantastic. She is talking about all the different, in particular in terms of domestic abuse, but really across the board, all the different ways that people can use technology to abuse other people in ways that the designer probably didn't intend. Yeah, right. Yeah. So one of the, I won't say harmless, but one of the less violent examples she gives is shared bank accounts, right? So if you and your partner have a shared bank account, what you actually have is one account that both of you can log into, which is kind of a different thing because now I actually have control over, I can actually take control over, because the way these things are usually set up, they're not set up to have two owners. They're set up to have one owner, but more than one person can have an access, but one of them ends up having more power than the other. They're literally set up to only really have one main owner, just from the way the technology is built, which means whoever that person is actually has the power in that bank account, which means to some extent, they have the power in that relationship, right? So it's things like that. And it's not because you have to build the technology that way. And this is kind of her point. Like you can build a system where two people share power in that system, but that's just not default how people do it. And part of the reason they don't do it is because it never occurs to them, oh, this could be used for real harm. Mm-hmm. So it's about understanding the potential for harm that a lot of these technologies have, that if you have never been in a situation where you don't have power, where you are vulnerable, and you build technology that impacts that situation, it would never even occur to you. Mm-hmm. Oh, maybe I shouldn't make it so that the person who isn't living there can control the thermostat. Right. So the book really gets deeply into diagnosing the problem, but also being very good about diagnosing the solutions. And I think an insight it gives that I think is really powerful is also working with the populations who have been the victims of and are the survivors of this tech. And does a really good job of, like, I get approached a lot about, like, because I talk a lot about when you are designing something, think about who will be affected by this, who doesn't have a lot of say in this, right? Because they're going to have to live with what you build. Mm-hmm. But what I'm not as good at is saying, okay, well, literally step by step how you do that. So if I'm working with survivors of abuse, because they're going to be impacted by this tech, until I read the book, I didn't have as clear an understanding of, okay, well, actually there's a protocol for that, because you can cause more harm if you just walk up to somebody who's the survivor of abuse and say, okay, walk me through your trauma. It's like, there are people who work with people who go through those things who can probably tell you everything you need to know. Maybe start there, right? Understanding these systems that are in place to sort of help people who don't have as much power, right? And that as a wiser, less harmful way of helping. Because another thing we're learning as some of us attempt to introduce less harm is that even the act of trying to reduce harm can cause harm. Right? It's a very frustrating but very true reality. And I think it's only better to get curious about that reality and find ways to say, to match your intent to your skill level, mm-hmm. right? To say my intent is not to cause harm, but not causing harm is a skill. You have to get good at it. It's not easy. You're not born just knowing how to not cause harm. So you have to learn. The same way that you have to learn, there's the thing. You have to learn how to do UX. You weren't born knowing how to do it. You weren't born knowing how to do user research and how to create a discussion guide. You weren't born, like, you had to learn all this other stuff. Learn this too, right? So, but that, I mean, that I've been reading or finished reading not too long ago. That's had some of the biggest impact. I highly recommend picking that book up.
I bought 2 copies to give out at UX Copenhagen this year. And Ava held a speech in 2020. So go to uxcopenhagen.com or YouTube. There's a UX Copenhagen channel there, and we've got her talk on there.
Yeah, she's one of my favorite speakers right now. She gives a great talk. Did you talk about the seatbelts in this one?
I can't remember
There's
about how they're designed for men. Or
well, there's a bit she does about, see, I call them a bit, like I think of it all like stand-up comedy, but there's a bit she has about how it took at least 3 decades for seatbelts to become like they're normal now, but like for a long time. And she does it in this way where it's clear that like, oh, there were people who thought that it was more dangerous to wear the seatbelt because you could get caught in a burning car, and it was actually safer to get thrown from the car. None of those people were scientists. And she's like, without having to put a hat on a hat, making very obvious analogies to how difficult it is to get scientific things to be believed, right? And how deadly. And to this day, right, New Hampshire is the one state that doesn't require seatbelts.
Yeah.
Guess which state has the most car crash fatalities?
fatalities, yeah. Wow. Yeah. I was gonna say something. I think I won't. About truth. Anyway, what are you reading? Anything else?
So there's another book I'm telling people to read right now, and it's depressing but necessary. I'm the depressing but necessary guy. But there's a book called The Half Has Never Been Told. I'm going to type the title now into the chat. It is a book about slavery and specifically the economic impact of it. Mm-hmm. And the basic thesis of the book is this: you don't get America without slavery. You do not, it cannot happen. The economic underpinnings of it in the North and the South, because the North is the one providing the loans, right, to actually start these plantations. Mm-hmm. Like it's a stock market, right? But it's not, in America, at least, we have this myth that like slavery was this thing America experimented with in college. No, it was fundamentally necessary as Native American genocide was to America, slavery was. Like, these are foundational things that if you did not do them, you don't get America, right? You might get something better, frankly, but you don't get America. And that's why race in particular, right, in a way that I will say is different from gender, which is arguably even more entrenched, or from sexuality, from a lot of different versions, or just different racial things, why Black race is so different and foundational and so hard to decouple. Like, I talk to people who are like, why can't we just all agree that dividing us around race is an enemy in and of itself? And I often get this from people who don't live in America. And I get it. Like, I wouldn't get it either if I didn't live here. I'd be like, why that particular thing? There's so many things to get divided over. What? When you read the book, you start to realize, oh no, this is it. You don't profit off of this for 400 years and then overnight be like, okay, we're not going to talk about it anymore. Or we're going to just not make money off it anymore because we kind of keep coming back to trying to. And it makes, once you see how foundational it makes sense. So just to give an idea just how foundational it is, one of my favorite stories from the book. So back in around the 1830s, they're basically trying to find a new way to make money off slaves. And one thing they do, they invent a financial instrument called, wait for it, a mortgage-backed security. The mortgage-backed security. So that name might sound familiar if you remember the housing financial crisis of 2008. Mortgage-backed securities were the things that they were bundling, basically home loans, really bad home loans that they were bundling and having other people buy the loan, basically making a bet that the loan is or isn't going to get paid off, and bundle a whole bunch of them and sell them all around the world. And when those things failed, dominoes started toppling and we get the 2008 financial crisis. So that was not the first time that happened. The first time it happened was mortgage-backed securities, except instead of for houses, they were mortgages for slaves. You have a guy who wants to start a plantation, and he goes to the banker or whoever and says, "Hey, loan me some money so that I can, buy all these slaves." And then cotton is huge. Cotton's like the housing market; it's never going to go under. So of course, it's a good bet. Yep, okay, I'll pay you back once I sell all this cotton. And then someone looks at that and says, okay, great, I'll buy that loan. In fact, why don't you put a whole bunch of those loans together into a tranche and I'll sell them. And they sold them all over the world. They were selling them in Paris. They were selling them in London, right? And then, as with all other bubbles, eventually cotton topped out and then the whole thing crashed. And instead of a bailout, which actually was a whole bunch of slave owners running to Texas, which wasn't a state yet, so that they never had to pay back their loan. So the whole phrase gone. So all of that, like reading that story, I'm like, oh my God, like the slavery was like houses. It was like any other normal quote unquote thing that we do in the market, that we do stupid stuff with in the market. But it was like the torture of human beings. But it wasn't, but it was just like, oh, this is what we do. So when you realize trying to decouple that and said, well, why don't you just stop talking about race? It's like, okay, let's also stop talking about houses. Right? Because it's nothing. It's just, yeah, that isn't important, you know? But anyway, I've been recommending, it's probably one of the most important books I've read to understand race. And I think understanding race is going to be necessary if we're going to get through points at the future. So that's why I've been like recommending to anybody who will listen, read that book.
Yeah. I will send out links to all the things that Dave has been mentioning and that I've been mentioning as well. So, wow. Yeah, that's a definite must read. And yeah. Anything else you're reading? Anything exciting?
What else am I reading right now? I hesitate to mention it because I can't talk that much about it, but I just finished a screenplay, writing a screenplay.
Writing a screenplay.
Yeah. As much as I can say is that it is a social justice horror film. I literally have sent it to get the copyright registered. Once that's done, I'll feel more comfortable going into detail about it in public. But that, and I will say that it has led me to do a lot of really interesting watching of different kinds of movies, reading of screenplays. So I read the Get Out screen. So highly recommended if you're interested in horror or kind of social justice horror. Jordan Peele created an annotated version of his screenplay for Get Out, which you can just get on Amazon, and it's fantastic. So it's just that it's an annotated version of the screenplay, and there's these little blurbs and footnotes, and you sort of see it's almost like director's commentary before the screenplay. So you can read the screenplay, but see all the different little pieces he was putting together. I read that was fascinating, and I've been watching a lot of blaxploitation cinema from the 70s. And it's really interesting because, you know, for those of you not familiar, there was a whole period in the 70s where a bunch of movies, genre films like action films, horror films, were created and targeted at the Black audience. Because in the inner city, there were all these movie theaters and we're sort of seeing, hey, here's a potential, you know, there's an audience here in these largely Black areas for this cinema. And they call it blaxploitation because they were sort of like very, you know, ludicrous kind of like, you know, sensationalized kind of like, you know, I mean, movies with titles like Blackula, right? And Cleopatra Jones, right? And the thing is, on the one level, yeah, there were these very sort of exploitative things. On the other level, though, what's really fascinating watching them is they are more honest about race than movies that are made today. Like the sort of racial insults at this, and also they center blackness and Black characters in a way that we're only starting to get back to today, but that you would not happen again for another 20, 30 years. So yeah, it's Blackula. It's about a, you know, Black vampire. It sounds kind of ridiculous, but the movie opens with in like the 1800s with a Black prince, an African prince visiting Count Dracula and being turned into a vampire. In this very kind of colonialist way where like white Dracula, the white European Dracula is kind of being like all colonialist about it, but it's fascinating, right? And like name another movie with an African prince, right? Like, I don't know, Coming to America and like Wakanda, so not even from real countries, right? Like, but that, like, that's rare, right? Or Cleopatra Jones. I gotta tell you about Cleopatra Jones. So Cleopatra Jones is sort of like Black female James Bond. And movie opens, right? You are looking at the poppy fields of Afghanistan. And there's all these dignitaries like lined up from all over the world. It's like the UN, but they're standing in a row in front of a chopper that's landing in this desert next to a poppy field. And out from the helicopter steps Cleopatra Jones, like this wonderful Black woman, sort of elegantly dressed, steps out, and everybody, these are heads of state, everybody is just being deferential, right? And she's giving off what I lovingly call white man energy. Like, she knows she owns the place, and she does own the place, and she just walks out there like she owns the place. And it is, again, I cannot name another movie that starts that way. I cannot name another movie where a Black woman is given that much deference by heads of state from all over the world. do you know, I don't know one, right? So it was this weird little pocket in film history where it was normalized for Black people to have power. And I'm like, huh, I didn't know about that. This is interesting. Where did all this go? But that's been this interesting exploration lately.
That's so interesting. It's kind of, time is kind of gone. Yeah. What does it say? Thank you. People are thanking you. Never disappointed in your talks. That's true. That's true.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Always such a pleasure to speak with you, Dave. And I'm so happy to have you back this year. Thank you.
I'm really excited. And, you know, like I said, we're given, I think March 30th is the workshop. So please come out for that. Tell your friends. If you know anybody who wants to learn more about inclusive design, have them sign up. I'm looking forward to seeing you all there.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I could talk to you for another hour, but I'm sure that you have something to do. So everybody, thank you for being here. And I will post this online, and I will also send out a bunch of links to you all.